Hi, Ethans. So every time someone finds out that I studied economics, their first question invariably is, what do you think about trickle-down economics? And what I think is, but let's talk about why that is. The term trickle-down economics is most closely associated with Ronald Reagan and his Reaganomics policy, but the term actually originated in 1932 with a comedian named Will Rogers, who wrote a column criticizing President Hoover's Depression-era policies. So trickle-down economics is a theory that states that benefits in the form of tax cuts to businesses, high-income earners, capital gains, and dividends will ultimately lead to economic growth. This theory expects that entities will invest this extra cash in expanding their business, that banks will increase their lending, and that owners will then invest in their business and hire more workers. And all of this economic growth ultimately will trickle down to the working class, who will have extra wages and then will spend those wages, thus creating a larger tax base. Every time I start talking about trickle-down economics, somebody wants to talk about supply-side economics, and I'm happy to talk about supply-side economics, but it is not trickle-down economics. They are similar and they've become synonymous in colloquial use, but they're not the same. Well, this is going to be an overgeneralization. Supply side basically says that all tax cuts will stimulate the economy. Trickle down says that specific tax cuts to the rich, the high earners, the businesses, dividends, capital gains, etc., that specifically will drive economic growth, and ultimately those benefits will then trickle down to the working class. Both supply side and trickle down usually refer to the Laffer curve in order to support their side. And the Laffer curve basically says that tax cuts at a certain level provide a multiplication effect. A foundational element of Laffer curve theory is that higher tax rates will mean fewer people want to work and that corporations will have less incentive to drive their revenue up. And there's a couple things to think about here. For workers, there's two different effects going on. There's something called the substitution effect, which is if employers respond to higher taxes by lowering wages, employees will prioritize other activities over working. The second is the income effect, which says that if employers respond to higher taxes by lowering wages, then workers will just find more jobs and work more hours in order to make ends meet. Which of these effects wins out depends a lot on how strong the country's social safety net is, but there's an obvious correlation between countries that have a higher tax rate and countries that have a stronger safety net. Ultimately, the Laffer curve suggests that if the tax rate is 70% or above, it can be lowered to reduce revenue. But if the tax rate is below a certain threshold, it actually does nothing to boost the economy. Now, I'm going to have to do a part 2 so we can talk about the policies during the Reagan and Bush administrations and how people thought that trickle-down economics was driving economic recovery, when in reality, it was almost assuredly other factors. It's important to note that trickle-down economics as a theory has never been tested independently. But the other factors that drive economic growth have. All right, see you part 2.